Open your fridge right now. There's always something in there. A half-eaten leftover, a carton of milk, something you could eat in the next 10 minutes if you had to. You've probably never gone more than a few hours without knowing exactly where your next meal was coming from. But for most of human history, that certainty didn't exist. Food could vanish for weeks. No warning, no backup plan, no emergency number to call. And yet the species survived. Not by accident, not by luck running out eventually in our favor, but through a system. One so effective that pieces of it are still baked into how you behave today, even though you've never had to use it for real. So how did they actually pull this off? Let's start with what no food really meant. Not skipping lunch. Not a bad grocery week. We're talking about the human body beginning to break down its own muscle for fuel within days of true starvation, and death becoming a real risk within a matter of weeks without any intake at all. A modern person who's never missed a real meal has no reference point for what sustained hunger does to a body. The exhaustion, the cognitive fog, the slow shutdown of everything that isn't essential to staying alive. Now imagine that risk wasn't rare. It was seasonal. It was one bad hunt, one failed harvest of wild plants, one harsh winter away. The popular image is always some version of desperate people wandering, eating whatever they could find, hoping to get lucky before they starved. Archaeology tells a different story. Not desperation, foresight. A story of people who treated food scarcity not as a surprise to react to, but as a predictable threat to plan around. Here's the first thing that should stop you. But before we go any further, tell us in the comments which country are you watching this from. Now, let's get into it. At Qesem Cave in Israel, researchers found something that pushed back everything we assumed about early food behavior. Humans living there as far back as 400,000 years ago weren't just eating what they killed and moving on. They were wrapping animal bones in skin and storing them deliberately, preserving the marrow inside for later. Chemical analysis shows that marrow was still being eaten up to 9 weeks after the animal was killed. 9 weeks. That's not a species living hand to mouth. That's a species already running an inventory system 400,000 years before anyone invented the word for it. But it wasn't a one-off trick. As you move forward in time, the pattern gets more deliberate, not less. Across the Upper Paleolithic, archaeologists have found storage pits at campsites, dug specifically to hold food in reserve, not just discard scraps. Long before farming existed, before anyone had planted a single seed on purpose, people in the Near East were building actual granaries, holding surplus food they hadn't even grown themselves, just gathered and set aside. Storage wasn't invented alongside agriculture, it came first. Farming didn't teach humans to plan for scarcity. Planning for scarcity is what eventually made farming possible, but storage alone doesn't explain the whole picture. And this is where it gets genuinely counterintuitive. Not every environment needed the same level of insurance. Researchers comparing hunter-gatherer groups found something specific. People living in cold climates experienced famine far more often than people living in warm ones. That makes sense on the surface. Fewer growing seasons, harsher winters, less margin for error. But here's the part that matters. Cold climate groups didn't just suffer more. They adapted more. The groups facing the highest risk developed the most sophisticated responses. Advanced food storage, long-distance seasonal migration timed around resource availability, specialized marine hunting technology to tap into food sources other groups couldn't reach, and trade networks stretching far beyond their immediate territory. The danger didn't just threaten these groups, it engineered them. Now here's the part most people get completely backwards, because it doesn't feel like survival strategy, it feels like generosity, food sharing. In hunter-gatherer societies, when someone made a big, unpredictable kill, that food didn't stay with. It got distributed. Researchers studying this behavior found it isn't random kindness. It's a calculated system. By sharing large, uncertain food windfalls across the group instead of hoarding them individually, everyone's personal risk of starving on any given week goes down, because you're not gambling alone anymore. You're spread across a network of other people who are doing the same for you. One bad week for you gets absorbed by someone else's good one. It's not charity, it's distributed insurance, running on trust instead of paperwork, and it appears again and again across completely unrelated hunter-gatherer cultures on different continents, which means it wasn't copied. It was independently discovered over and over because it works. This is also probably why food sharing still feels emotionally loaded to you today. Why eating alone feels different from eating with people. Why offering someone food still reads as an act of care instead of just a transaction. That instinct isn't sentimental leftover. It's the fossil of a system that used to be the difference between your ancestors' family surviving the winter or not. Put these three pieces together and the picture flips completely. It wasn't storage that saved early humans. It wasn't migration. It wasn't sharing. It was all three running at once, as a single layered system. Store what you can, move toward what you can't store, and distribute risk across people you trust. When both of those fail, miss one layer and the other two were there to catch you. But this system didn't disappear when it stopped being strictly necessary. Modern crisis response researchers studying food insecurity in vulnerable communities today still map onto the exact same three levers: storage, mobility toward resources, and social distribution networks, because the underlying math of surviving unpredictable scarcity hasn't changed, even though the stakes for most of us reading this have. Go back to that fridge. It's not just convenience sitting behind that door. It's the end point of a system your ancestors spent hundreds of thousands of years building and refining, one bad winter at a time, because the alternative wasn't inconvenience, it was extinction. You didn't inherit a full fridge by default. You inherited it because enough people, for enough generations, got the storage, the movement, and the sharing right over and over until it became instinct instead of strategy. If starvation was the threat you could plan around, there was another one you couldn't store or share your way out of. One that showed up without warning and didn't care how much food you had saved. That's next. How did ancient humans actually survive getting sick?